The most expensive mistake in business is believing you know who holds the power before the meeting even begins. At exactly 8 a.m., the private elevator opened onto the 42nd floor of Whitmore Financial Tower in Manhattan, and Angela Brooks stepped out carrying a slim leather portfolio and a calm expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Outside the boardroom, assistants moved quickly between glass offices, preparing for what many insiders were already calling the most important corporate meeting of the year. A multi-billion-dollar expansion deal was on the table, investors were watching closely, and every major business publication in America seemed interested in the outcome. Angela walked through the hallway with measured confidence, her navy business suit perfectly tailored, her posture relaxed, her attention focused. She had attended hundreds of executive meetings before, but today felt different. Not because of the numbers involved, not because of the media attention, because she knew something nobody else in that building seemed to understand. As she approached the large conference room, conversations could already be heard through the closed doors. Laughter, confidence, assumptions, the kind of atmosphere that develops when people believe the result has already been decided. When Angela entered, several board members looked up briefly before returning to their conversations. At the far end of the polished conference table sat Richard Whitmore, the billionaire founder whose reputation had become almost legendary on Wall Street. He was surrounded by executives eager for his approval and investors who treated every sentence he spoke as if it carried special significance. The moment Angela walked toward him, a few people noticed. She extended her hand with professional courtesy, the same gesture exchanged in boardrooms across America every day. For a second, the room seemed to slow down. Richard looked directly at her hand, then at her face, then back at her hand. Instead of standing, he leaned back in his chair. Instead of returning the greeting, he offered a thin smile and turned toward the executive seated beside him. A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others pretended not to notice. The handshake remained unanswered. Angela lowered her hand without changing expression. No reaction, no visible irritation, no attempt to force the moment. She simply took her seat. The silence lasted only a second before conversations resumed, but something had shifted. One board member chuckled awkwardly. Another followed. Within moments, several people were smiling as though they had witnessed a harmless social exchange rather than a deliberate public slight. Richard appeared pleased with himself. Angela opened her portfolio and reviewed a few notes as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the table, executives whispered quietly among themselves. Some were curious. Some were amused. None of them realized they were witnessing the first move in a game whose outcome would cost far more than anyone in that room could imagine. And while the board believed they were preparing to discuss a $3 billion opportunity, Angela Brooks already knew that before the day was over, the real conversation would be about something entirely different. Who actually controlled the future sitting inside that boardroom? The meeting officially began 3 minutes later, and the atmosphere inside the boardroom settled into the familiar rhythm of corporate confidence. Large presentation screens illuminated the walls while assistants distributed financial packets around the table. Richard Whitmore remained at the center of attention. Every comment he made drew nods from executives. Every observation seemed to receive immediate agreement. Angela sat quietly near the middle of the table, reviewing figures that she clearly already knew by memory. To most people in the room, she appeared isolated. To Angela, it was simply information. The chairman opened the session and thanked everyone for attending before turning the floor over to Richard. The billionaire rose slowly, adjusted his jacket, and began speaking about growth projections, acquisition opportunities, and future market dominance. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Several board members smiled as he spoke. Others hurried to take notes. 15 minutes into the presentation, Richard paused and looked directly toward Angela. "I understand there may be some concerns about the expansion strategy," he said, "although I am not sure those concerns are based on real market experience." A few people laughed softly. The comment was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation but obvious enough for everyone to understand its target. Angela remained focused on her documents. Richard continued, Sometimes people become overly cautious when they have never managed projects at this scale. This time the laughter became more noticeable. A board member near the end of the table leaned toward another and whispered something that produced a grin. The chairman did nothing to stop it. Angela slowly closed one folder and opened another. No reaction. No defense. No attempt to explain herself. The absence of a response seemed to encourage Richard even more. He moved through slide after slide, presenting aggressive forecasts and ambitious revenue targets. Every few minutes he would glance toward Angela as if inviting disagreement. Every few minutes she declined the invitation by remaining calm. As the presentation continued, several board members became increasingly confident that the outcome had already been decided. The expansion proposal would pass. Richard would receive another public victory. The meeting would end before lunch. What nobody noticed was that Angela was not reviewing Richard's projections. She was studying a completely different set of numbers. At one point, a senior director asked Richard where the final capital commitment would originate if market conditions changed unexpectedly. Richard smiled. "We have excellent relationships across the financial sector," he replied. "Funding will not be a problem." The answer seemed to satisfy the room. Yet Angela quietly wrote something in the margin of her notes. Another executive asked whether all participating investors had fully approved the structure. Richard answered with the same confidence. "Everyone important is already aligned." More nods followed. More agreement. More certainty. Across the table, Angela finally looked up for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. Her expression remained unreadable. She glanced briefly at the screen displaying projected funding commitments, then at the executives celebrating numbers they clearly believed were guaranteed. For a moment, her eyes rested on a single line near the bottom of the presentation. A line most people ignored because it appeared routine. Angela looked at it for several seconds before returning to her notes. The meeting moved forward. The room grew more confident. And with every minute that passed, more people unknowingly built their expectations upon a foundation they had never actually examined. By 9 o'clock, confidence had completely taken over the room. The discussion was no longer about whether the expansion would happen. It was about how quickly everyone could benefit from it. Executives spoke about future market share. Board members discussed media coverage. Investors exchanged optimistic projections. Richard Whitmore sat comfortably at the center of it all, enjoying the attention that followed every statement he made. The atmosphere felt less like a serious review and more like a celebration before the result had been earned. Angela Brooks listened carefully as the conversation moved from analysis to assumptions. The distinction mattered. In her experience, companies rarely got into trouble because of bad numbers. They got into trouble because successful people stopped asking difficult questions. Richard stood again and pointed toward a chart showing projected revenue growth over the next 5 years. The numbers were impressive. Several board members nodded before he even finished speaking. One executive called the proposal transformational. Another described it as inevitable. Richard smiled. "Exactly," he said. "The market is practically inviting us to take this opportunity." Then he glanced toward Angela. "Of course, some people see obstacles everywhere. That tends to happen when they spend more time worrying than building." A few people laughed. This time the reaction was louder than before. Angela remained silent. Her composure seemed to frustrate Richard because every attempt to provoke a response simply disappeared into calm professionalism. A director seated near the chairman decided to join the performance. "Perhaps we should focus on execution instead of hypothetical concerns," he said while looking directly at Angela. More smiles appeared around the table. Angela slowly closed another folder and folded her hands. She still did not respond. To the people in the room, her silence looked like weakness. To anyone paying close attention, it looked like patience. The meeting continued. Financial projections filled the screens. Future acquisitions were discussed. Market forecasts were presented. Yet Angela noticed something unusual. Every presentation referenced committed capital. Every projection depended on funding certainty. But nobody seemed interested in examining the actual structure behind those commitments. The board was treating the money as guaranteed simply because Richard said it was. Finally, the chief financial officer spoke up. "There is one issue I would like clarified," he said. "Several funding commitments appear to be connected through a strategic consortium. Can we confirm there are no approval risks remaining?" Richard answered immediately. "There are none." The confidence in his voice ended the discussion before it could begin. Most people accepted the answer without hesitation. Angela looked toward the financial officer. For a brief moment their eyes met. He seemed uncertain, not convinced, just uncertain. It was the first sign that someone else in the room had started asking questions. Richard continued speaking. "Everything important has already been handled. The approvals are routine. We are wasting time discussing details that have already been settled." The board appeared relieved. Nobody wanted complications. Nobody wanted delays. Yet as Angela reviewed the funding documents one more time, she noticed something that made her pause. It was not a large figure. It was not a hidden clause. It was a name attached to an approval authority buried deep inside the funding structure. A name that most people would overlook because they assumed it was administrative. Angela quietly turned the page and said nothing. Across the room, Richard continued celebrating a victory that existed only in his imagination. And with every confident statement he made, he moved one step closer to discovering how little he actually understood about the deal he believed he controlled. The discussion shifted toward execution timelines, and the energy inside the room became even more optimistic. Several board members began talking as if the expansion had already succeeded. One director suggested announcing the initiative to the media within 48 hours. Another proposed scheduling investor interviews before the quarter ended. The confidence was contagious. Even cautious executives appeared eager to move forward. Richard Whitmore encouraged the momentum. He walked toward the presentation screen and highlighted projected milestones across multiple states. New facilities, new partnerships, new revenue streams. Every slide painted a picture of certainty. "This is what leadership looks like," Richard said confidently. "Decisive action, not hesitation." A few people immediately nodded. The chairman smiled. The atmosphere increasingly resembled a victory lap. Angela Brooks listened without interruption. She had spent enough years in business to recognize when excitement began replacing discipline. The room was no longer evaluating a proposal. The room was defending a conclusion it had already chosen. As Richard continued speaking, Angela noticed that several executives had stopped reviewing the documents entirely. They were simply accepting whatever appeared on the screen. The chief financial officer, however, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He flipped through pages, occasionally comparing figures from different sections of the funding package. Twice he raised questions, and twice Richard brushed them aside with confident assurances. "Those details have already been verified," Richard said. "We do not need to waste valuable time revisiting settled issues." The response satisfied most people. It did not satisfy the financial officer. Angela noticed him underline something on one page before quietly setting it aside. 20 minutes later, the board moved to discussion of risk management. Ironically, the conversation focused almost entirely on external threats. Market conditions, competitors, regulatory changes. Nobody seemed interested in discussing internal assumptions. Nobody questioned whether every critical approval behind the funding structure truly existed. Richard welcomed the conversation because it allowed him to present himself as the solution to every challenge. "Relationships matter," he said. "When you have spent decades building trust, opportunities open themselves." The room rewarded the statement with approving smiles. Angela remained silent. Then something small happened. One board member asked for clarification regarding the consortium responsible for a substantial portion of the committed capital. The question was simple: who held final authority if changes became necessary before funds were released? Richard answered immediately: "The consortium leadership is fully aligned." The board member appeared satisfied, but Angela noticed something else. Richard had answered around the question, not through it. He had described alignment. He had not identified authority. The distinction was subtle but important. Angela opened the funding packet once more and studied the approval structure. Several signatures appeared throughout the documents. Several organizations were represented. Yet one approval line remained more significant than all the others. The same name she had noticed earlier appeared again. Buried in technical language. Easy to miss. Essential to everything. Across the room, Richard continued describing future success while executives imagined promotions, bonuses, and headlines. Nobody realized that the foundation supporting those dreams rested on a decision controlled by someone sitting quietly at the same table. And while the board celebrated certainty, Angela found herself wondering how the room would react if it discovered that the most important signature in the entire deal belonged to the person they had spent the entire morning underestimating. As the morning approached its third hour, the board's confidence had evolved into certainty. The discussion was no longer centered on whether the expansion should move forward. The only remaining question seemed to be how quickly the company could begin executing the plan. Richard Whitmore appeared increasingly comfortable with every passing minute. He answered questions before they were fully asked. He dismissed concerns before they were fully explained. The board rewarded that confidence with trust. For many people in the room, confidence and competence had become the same thing. Angela Brooks understood that mistake better than most. She had spent her career watching talented people overlooked while charismatic people were promoted. She had learned that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the most informed. The chairman eventually suggested moving toward a preliminary approval vote. Several board members immediately supported the idea. One executive even joked that the outcome seemed obvious. A few people laughed. Richard smiled and leaned back in his chair. The atmosphere felt almost relaxed, almost casual, as if $3 billion represented little more than a formality. Angela looked around the room carefully. Every person revealed something. Some looked excited. Some looked relieved. Some appeared eager to attach themselves to a successful deal. Only one person still seemed uncertain. The chief financial officer continued reviewing documents. His attention kept returning to the funding section. He turned pages back and forth, compared figures, studied footnotes. Angela noticed it immediately. Eventually he cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he said, "there is one administrative item I would like clarified." Several people sighed quietly. Richard's expression suggested impatience. "Go ahead," he said. The financial officer adjusted his glasses. "The consortium approval chain appears more concentrated than I originally understood. If circumstances change, who possesses final authorization regarding release of committed capital?" The room became still for a moment. Richard answered quickly. Too quickly. "That will not be an issue." The financial officer nodded politely. "I understand. I am asking who holds the authority." Richard smiled. "The consortium is fully aligned." Again, he avoided the question. Angela noticed a subtle change in the room. Most people missed it. The answer sounded reassuring on the surface, but a few executives exchanged brief glances. For the first time all morning, uncertainty entered the conversation. The financial officer looked down at his documents. "That is not exactly what I asked," he said carefully. Richard's smile faded slightly. "Are we really going to delay progress over procedural technicalities?" Several board members immediately sided with him. One director remarked that successful businesses moved decisively. Another suggested that excessive caution could become its own risk. The discussion began drifting away from the original question. Angela remained silent, yet internally she found the moment fascinating. The most important question of the day had finally been asked, and nobody seemed interested in hearing the answer. They wanted momentum. They wanted certainty. They wanted the deal. Across the room, Richard appeared satisfied that the challenge had been neutralized. He resumed discussing future growth opportunities as if nothing had happened. But the financial officer was no longer taking notes. He was staring directly at a single approval page. A page containing a name that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And for the first time that morning, Someone besides Angela was beginning to realize that the true source of authority inside the funding structure might not be the person standing confidently at the front of the room. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had changed, although most people had not noticed it yet. Earlier, the room had been filled with certainty. Now there was a faint trace of curiosity beneath the confidence. The chief financial officer had asked a simple question, and despite Richard Whitmore's efforts to move past it, the question remained unanswered. Who actually held final authority over the release of the consortium's capital? Richard continued leading the discussion as if nothing important had happened. He spoke about expansion opportunities in Texas, Florida, and Arizona. He described projected earnings growth. He referenced future partnerships and long-term shareholder value. The board followed along eagerly, but Angela Brooks noticed something different. Several executives were no longer fully focused on the presentation. Their attention occasionally drifted back toward the funding documents resting in front of them. Once a question enters a room, it rarely disappears. It waits. It grows. It demands an answer. One director eventually raised another issue regarding implementation schedules. Richard answered confidently. Another director asked about market timing. Again, Richard responded immediately. Then a third board member casually returned to the subject everyone was pretending to ignore. Just for clarity, he said, "Are all consortium approvals already finalized?" Richard smiled. Absolutely. The answer sounded strong. Yet this time the board member followed up. And there are no remaining authorization requirements? For a brief moment, Richard hesitated. It was less than a second. Most people missed it. Angela did not. Neither did the chief financial officer. Everything necessary will be completed, Richard replied. The wording was different. Earlier he had spoken with certainty. Now he spoke with confidence but not precision. The distinction was small yet meaningful. The chief financial officer slowly turned another page. Angela could almost see the pieces beginning to connect in his mind. Across the room, Richard seemed unaware of the shift taking place. He interpreted the silence as agreement. He believed the room remained under his influence. In reality, curiosity had started replacing blind trust. The chairman suggested a short break before moving toward formal approval discussions. As executives stood and stretched, small conversations formed around the room. Angela remained seated. She reviewed a few pages and made several notes. A board member approached Richard and quietly asked something about the consortium. Richard responded with visible confidence, but the conversation lasted longer than expected. Nearby, the chief financial officer remained focused on the approval documentation. He was no longer searching for financial data. He was searching for authority. 5 minutes later, everyone returned to their seats. The room settled. The chairman prepared to continue. Then something unexpected happened. The chief financial officer raised his hand once more. This time there was no uncertainty in his voice. "Before we proceed," he said, "I believe we should verify the approval structure attached to the consortium commitments." The room became quiet. Richard's expression tightened slightly. Angela looked up from her documents for the first time in several minutes. She did not smile. She did not react. But deep inside, she knew the meeting had just crossed an invisible line. The conversation was no longer about projections, forecasts, or future opportunities. It was beginning to move toward the one subject Richard had spent the entire morning trying to avoid: the truth. The room remained unusually quiet after the chief financial officer spoke. Moments earlier, confidence had dominated every discussion. Now attention had narrowed toward a single issue buried deep inside the funding structure. The chairman adjusted his glasses and looked toward the financial officer. "What specifically would you like verified?" he asked. The financial officer slid several pages across the table. "The authorization chain," he replied. "The funding commitments are substantial, and I want to ensure we understand exactly where final approval authority resides." Nobody spoke for a moment. Several board members glanced toward Richard Whitmore, expecting him to dismiss the concern as he had throughout the morning. Richard maintained a confident smile. "We have already discussed this," he said. The consortium is fully committed. The financial officer nodded. That is not in question. I am discussing authority. Richard leaned back slightly. Authority is aligned with commitment. It sounded persuasive. It sounded reasonable. Yet it still was not an answer. Angela Brooks observed the exchange without interruption. She noticed something important. Earlier in the meeting, Richard's confidence had guided the room. Now people were beginning to listen more carefully to the actual words being spoken. Confidence alone was losing some of its power. One board member flipped through the funding documents. Another followed. Soon several executives were reviewing pages they had barely examined before. The chairman finally looked down at the authorization section himself. Let us clarify this and move forward, he said. Where exactly is final approval documented? The financial officer pointed to a specific page. A few seconds later, additional copies appeared on screens around the room. Richard's expression remained composed, but Angela noticed his attention sharpen immediately. The page contained technical language that most people would normally skip. Approval conditions, release triggers, oversight procedures, the kind of legal structure rarely discussed during optimistic presentations. Several board members scanned the text silently. One director frowned. Another leaned closer to the screen. The chairman continued reading. Interesting, he said quietly. I was not aware of this provision. Richard immediately responded. It is standard language. The financial officer did not argue. Instead, he asked a simple question. Then why is a single approval authority referenced repeatedly throughout the structure? The room became still once again. Several executives searched the page more carefully. Within seconds, they found what he was referencing. A name appeared multiple times. Not in large print. Not highlighted. Yet impossible to ignore once noticed. One board member looked confused. Who is this? He asked. Another executive began searching through supporting documents. The chairman continued reading silently. Richard spoke before anyone else could. Administrative oversight, he said casually. Nothing unusual. Yet this explanation produced a different reaction than his earlier assurances. Nobody immediately accepted it. Too many people were now looking at the same page. Too many people were noticing the same pattern. Angela remained completely calm. She neither encouraged nor discouraged the discussion. She simply watched as curiosity spread through the room. For the first time all morning, Richard was no longer controlling the conversation. The documents were. And as more executives examined the approval structure, an uncomfortable realization slowly began forming. The authority behind $3 billion in committed funding might not belong to the billionaire everyone had been following. It might belong to someone else entirely. Someone sitting quietly at the same table. The discovery changed the mood of the room more than anyone wanted to admit. Minutes earlier, board members had been discussing expansion plans and future profits. Now they were studying approval documents with the concentration usually reserved for legal disputes and regulatory investigations. The chairman adjusted the screen display and enlarged the authorization section so everyone could see it clearly. The name appeared again, and again, and again. Each reference pointed toward the same approval authority. Several directors exchanged uncertain looks. One executive finally spoke. If this authority is merely administrative, why is it attached to every major funding release? Nobody answered immediately. Richard Whitmore leaned forward and clasped his hands together. Because legal departments enjoy creating layers of paperwork, he said with a dismissive smile. A few people chuckled politely, but the reaction lacked the confidence that had filled the room earlier. The explanation felt incomplete. The chief financial officer continued reviewing the documents. Administrative oversight normally does not include approval authority over capital deployment, he said carefully. This language appears much broader than that. Richard's smile tightened slightly. You are overanalyzing routine documentation. Once again, he attempted to close the discussion. This time, however, the room refused to move on. Curiosity had become stronger than momentum. A senior director who had spent most of the morning supporting Richard suddenly leaned closer to the screen. "Can someone identify who this authority actually reports to?" he asked. Several executives began searching through supporting materials. Laptops opened. Pages turned. Quiet conversations spread across the table. Angela Brooks remained completely composed. She watched the process unfold with the patience of someone observing people discover information that had always been available to them. One analyst located an organizational chart connected to the consortium. Another found a governance document. Within minutes, pieces of information began appearing across screens throughout the room. The chairman studied the material carefully. "Interesting," he said. "This authority does not appear to report through the consortium structure at all." That observation immediately attracted attention. Richard shifted in his seat. For the first time all day, he seemed less interested in speaking and more interested in listening. The chief financial officer continued connecting documents together. "That is because the position sits above operational management," he said. Silence followed. Several board members looked confused. Others appeared concerned. One executive asked the obvious question. "Above operational management means what exactly?" The financial officer looked down at the page once more before answering. "It means the authority exists independently from day-to-day consortium leadership." The room grew even quieter. Earlier that morning, everyone had assumed the funding structure flowed naturally through Richard's relationships and influence. Now those assumptions were beginning to crack. The chairman folded his hands and looked around the table. "I think we need complete clarity before proceeding with any vote," he said. Nobody disagreed. Even the directors who had been eager to move forward seemed reluctant now. Angela noticed the change immediately. Hours earlier, people had laughed, interrupted, and dismissed concerns. Now they were asking questions. Serious questions. Necessary questions. And with every answer uncovered inside the documents, the distance between perceived power and actual authority became a little more visible. What nobody besides Angela fully understood yet was that they were still only seeing part of the picture. The name hidden throughout the approval structure was important. But the identity connected to that name was far more surprising than anyone in the room was prepared to discover. The boardroom had become almost unrecognizable from the room that existed earlier that morning. The laughter was gone. The casual confidence was gone. Even the executives who had spent hours agreeing with Richard Whitmore now appeared cautious. Documents covered the table. Screens displayed governance charts, authorization structures, and consortium agreements. Every new page seemed to raise another question. The chairman finally looked toward the legal counsel. "Can we determine who ultimately controls this approval authority?" he asked. The attorney reviewed several documents before responding. "We can identify the position," she said. "The question is whether everyone understands what that position actually represents." Her answer only deepened the curiosity. Several board members leaned forward. Richard remained silent. It was a noticeable change. Earlier he had answered every question immediately. Now he appeared content to let others speak. The chief financial officer opened another document and projected it onto the screen. "This is the governance framework connected to the consortium," he explained. "The approval authority does not operate as a ceremonial position. It has direct authority over capital deployment, strategic release conditions, and funding authorization." A director frowned. "Meaning what exactly?" The financial officer pointed to several highlighted sections. "Meaning that if this authority declines approval, the funding does not move." The room became quiet again. One executive looked surprised. $3 billion depends on a single approval? "Not a single person," the financial officer corrected. "A single authority." The distinction sounded important, although few people fully understood it yet. The chairman studied the document carefully. "And this authority exists outside the normal operational structure?" "Correct," the financial officer replied. "That is why it appears repeatedly throughout the agreements." Angela Brooks listened without interruption. She noticed that several people were beginning to look at her differently. Not because they knew anything, They did not. But they could sense that she was not surprised by any of the information being discussed. While others appeared confused, Angela appeared patient. While others searched for answers, Angela seemed content to wait. One board member eventually noticed the same thing. "Angela," he said cautiously, "you have been remarkably quiet throughout this entire discussion." Several heads turned toward her. Richard looked in her direction as well. Angela offered a polite smile. "I have been listening," she replied. "Nothing more." The answer created even greater curiosity. The chairman looked back toward the documents. "Can we identify the reporting structure connected to this authority?" he asked. The legal counsel searched through several supporting files. After nearly a minute, she stopped reading. Her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for people to notice. "That is interesting," she said. "What?" asked one director. The attorney looked up from the screen. "This authority does not appear to report through the consortium at all." The room became silent. "Then who does it report to?" someone asked. The attorney hesitated. "According to these documents, the authority operates through an independent governance office established by the primary capital partner." Several executives exchanged confused looks. The chief financial officer immediately requested additional files. More documents appeared on the screen. More pages were reviewed. Then slowly, piece by piece, a picture began forming. The authority behind the funding was not connected to Richard's influence. It was not controlled by the board. It was not tied to the executives sitting around the table. It originated from somewhere else entirely. And as the final supporting document appeared on the screen, several people began realizing that the answer they were searching for might be sitting much closer than they ever imagined. The search for answers accelerated. Documents moved from one screen to another as legal counsel, finance executives, and board members worked together to trace the chain of authority hidden inside the funding structure. What had started as a routine board meeting now felt more like an investigation. Nobody seemed interested in expansion timelines anymore. Nobody was discussing market forecasts. The entire room had become focused on a single question. Who actually controlled the approval process behind the consortium's $3 billion in committed capital? The chairman reviewed another governance document while the chief financial officer examined a related authorization file. Several minutes passed in complete silence except for the occasional sound of pages turning. Richard Whitmore remained unusually quiet. Earlier in the day, he had dominated every conversation. Now he appeared content to observe. Whether that silence reflected caution or confidence, nobody could tell. Finally, the legal counsel spoke. "I believe we have identified the structure." Every eye in the room turned toward her. She displayed a document on the main screen. "The consortium operates through multiple investment entities," she explained. "However, final release authority is consolidated through an independent governance office established by the primary funding partner." One director frowned. "And who oversees that office?" The attorney clicked to another page. A detailed organizational chart appeared. The room studied it carefully. The answer was there, hidden in plain sight. The chairman leaned forward. The chief financial officer narrowed his eyes. Several executives exchanged confused looks. One board member suddenly sat upright. "Wait a second," he said quietly. "That cannot be correct." Nobody responded immediately. The attorney reviewed the information again. "According to these records, it is correct." The room grew still. Angela Brooks remained calm. Her expression had not changed since the meeting began. Yet for the first time all morning, people were paying close attention to her. Not because she had spoken, because she had not. While everyone else reacted to each new discovery, Angela seemed completely unsurprised. The chairman looked from the screen toward Angela, then back toward the screen again. "Can someone explain this reporting relationship?" he asked. The chief financial officer answered slowly. "The authority overseeing final funding approval appears connected directly to the primary capital partner's executive governance office." "And?" asked one director. The financial officer hesitated. "And according to the documentation, Executive governance authority is held by the office of the managing principal. The room became silent once again. Several board members searched through the supporting files. Within seconds, more people began noticing the same thing. The same name appeared repeatedly across the authorization structure. Not buried this time. Not hidden. Clearly documented. One executive looked toward Angela. Another followed. Then another. Richard noticed the shift immediately. The room's attention was moving away from him. The chairman finally spoke. "Angela," he said carefully, "is there something about this structure that we should understand?" Every person in the room turned toward her. For the first time since the meeting began, Angela closed her folder and placed it on the table. She did not appear nervous. She did not appear angry. She simply appeared prepared. The silence stretched across the room. Hours earlier, many of these same people had laughed when she was dismissed. Now those same people waited for her response. And although nobody fully understood it yet, the balance of power inside the boardroom had already begun to shift. Angela Brooks looked around the room before speaking. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the one she encountered when she first entered that morning. The laughter was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was attention. Every executive, every director, and every advisor was waiting for an answer. Angela folded her hands calmly on the table. "I believe there may be some confusion regarding the consortium structure," she said. Her voice was steady and professional. No anger. No triumph. Just clarity. The chairman nodded. "Please help us understand." Angela glanced briefly at the documents displayed on the screen. The governance office referenced throughout those agreements exists to protect capital partners from unnecessary risk. It was designed specifically to ensure that major funding decisions receive independent review before capital is released. Several board members listened carefully. The chief financial officer appeared especially interested. "And who oversees that review process?" he asked. Angela met his eyes. "I do." The room became completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The statement seemed to suspend the meeting in place. Several executives looked toward the screen again as though hoping the documents would somehow say something different. The chairman slowly removed his glasses. Richard Whitmore remained motionless. The chief financial officer looked down at the authorization structure one more time and then nodded slightly. The discovery confirmed what he had been piecing together for hours. One director finally broke the silence. "You oversee the governance office?" Angela nodded. "I have for several years." Another executive frowned. "Then the final approval authority belongs to you?" "The authority belongs to the office," Angela replied. "I serve as its managing principal." The distinction was technically accurate, but everyone in the room understood its practical meaning. The chairman looked genuinely surprised. "Why was this never discussed?" Angela answered immediately. "Because nobody asked." The response landed heavily. It was impossible to argue with. The information had been present in the documents from the beginning. The board simply never examined it closely enough. Earlier that morning, assumptions had replaced diligence. Reputation had replaced verification. Confidence had replaced questions. Richard finally spoke. "The consortium remains committed to the transaction," he said. His voice remained controlled, but it lacked the certainty that had defined his earlier remarks. Angela looked toward him. "The consortium remains interested in opportunities that meet governance standards." Several people immediately noticed the difference in wording. Interested was not the same as committed. The chairman noticed it as well. "Are you saying approval has not yet been granted?" Angela remained calm. "I am saying that approval is contingent upon review, just as the documents indicate." Silence returned. One executive closed his laptop. Another leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. The power structure everyone had assumed existed throughout the meeting had suddenly been exposed as an illusion. Richard had influence. Richard had relationships. Richard had reputation. But authority over the funding itself belonged elsewhere. And that authority had been sitting quietly in the room all day. Angela glanced around the table one final time. Many of the same people who had dismissed her opinions earlier now seemed reluctant to speak at all. The shift was impossible to ignore. Yet despite everything that had happened, Angela had not raised her voice, challenged anyone publicly, or demanded recognition. She had simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. And the facts were finally impossible to ignore. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The revelation had changed the entire meeting. Hours of assumptions had collapsed in a matter of moments. Executives who had confidently discussed expansion plans now sat quietly reviewing the same documents they had ignored earlier. Board members who had accepted every assurance without question were suddenly examining details with extraordinary care. The chairman looked toward Angela Brooks with a mixture of surprise and respect. "To be clear," he said carefully, "the consortium funding cannot be released without approval from the governance office under your leadership?" Angela nodded. "That is correct." The answer settled over the room like a final piece of a puzzle. The chief financial officer closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. "That explains the authorization structure," he said quietly. Several directors nodded in agreement. What had seemed confusing only an hour earlier now appeared obvious. The documentation had been accurate all along. The problem was not the documents. The problem was that people had chosen confidence over verification. One board member looked toward Richard Whitmore. "Were you aware of this structure?" The question hung in the air. Richard maintained his composure. "I was aware of the governance requirements," he replied. It was a careful answer, technically responsive, yet noticeably different from the certainty that had characterized his earlier remarks. Another director frowned. Then why was the board given the impression that approval was already secured? No one answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Around the table, attention continued shifting. Earlier in the day, nearly every conversation had revolved around Richard. Now the board's focus rested almost entirely on Angela. Not because she demanded attention, because she had earned credibility. Throughout the meeting she had remained calm while others rushed toward conclusions. She had listened while others dismissed questions. She had respected the process while others treated it as a formality. The contrast had become impossible to ignore. The chairman reviewed his notes before speaking again. "Angela, based on what you have seen today, what is the status of the review process?" Several executives straightened in their seats. The question mattered. More importantly, the answer mattered. Angela considered her response carefully. "The review remains incomplete," she said. "The governance office evaluates more than financial projections. Leadership judgment, transparency, and decision-making processes are also considered." A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. The statement was professional, yet its implications were difficult to miss. The chief financial officer nodded slowly. "In other words, the review evaluates how the opportunity is being managed, not simply the opportunity itself." "Correct," Angela replied. Richard remained silent. Earlier that morning he had controlled the pace of every discussion. Now he found himself listening alongside everyone else. One executive who had laughed during the opening hours of the meeting cleared his throat awkwardly. Another director avoided eye contact altogether. The social dynamics of the room had shifted dramatically. People were remembering their earlier behavior. They were remembering assumptions they had made. They were remembering opportunities they had ignored to ask better questions. The chairman finally folded his hands. "Then it appears we have reached an important conclusion," he said. "No approval vote should occur today." Nobody objected. Not a single person. The proposal that had seemed inevitable only hours earlier was now paused indefinitely. And as the board accepted that reality, many people began realizing that the most influential person in the room had never been the loudest voice. It had been the person patient enough to let the truth reveal itself. The meeting officially ended shortly after noon, but nobody rushed toward the door. People remained seated, quietly processing everything that had happened. The boardroom that had begun the morning with certainty now felt reflective. Documents remained scattered across the table. Presentation screens still displayed charts that no longer seemed important. The numbers had not changed. The projections had not changed. Yet the entire meaning of the meeting had changed because people finally understood who was responsible for protecting the capital behind those projections. The chairman stood first and thanked everyone for their participation. His words were formal, but his tone carried a different level of respect than it had earlier that morning. Several directors approached Angela Brooks individually. Some asked thoughtful questions about governance standards. Others thanked her for providing clarity. A few offered quiet apologies without explicitly calling them apologies. Angela responded professionally to each conversation. She did not embarrass anyone. She did not remind them how they had treated her. She simply treated every person with the same respect she had shown from the beginning. Across the room, Richard Whitmore gathered his documents in silence. No dramatic confrontation occurred. No public argument followed. The consequences had already arrived on their own. The board had postponed the vote. The funding review would continue under proper governance procedures. Assumptions had been replaced by accountability. That was enough. As executives gradually left the room, the chief financial officer approached Angela. "I am glad I kept asking questions," he said with a small smile. Angela smiled back. "Questions are usually cheaper than mistakes." He laughed quietly. "That might be the most valuable thing said in this building today." A few minutes later, only a handful of people remained. The chairman walked over and extended his hand. Angela accepted it. "Thank you for your professionalism," he said. "You could have handled this very differently." Angela nodded. The goal was never to win an argument. The goal was to make a good decision. The chairman considered that for a moment before shaking his head with admiration. Not enough leaders think that way. Eventually, Angela gathered her portfolio and prepared to leave. As she walked toward the door, she passed the same conference table where people had laughed hours earlier. The same room, the same people, yet everything felt different. Not because power had changed hands. Power had never changed hands. The room had simply discovered where it had been all along. Near the exit, Richard finally spoke. His voice was calm. "Angela." She stopped and turned. For a brief moment, neither person said anything. Then Richard nodded once. It was not a speech. It was not an excuse. It was simply recognition. Angela returned the nod and continued walking. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside and watched the boardroom disappear from view. The morning had started with assumptions, status, and appearances. It ended with facts. And as the elevator descended through the Manhattan skyline, one lesson remained clearer than any financial projection discussed that day. Respect costs nothing to give, but the absence of it can become the most expensive mistake in the room.